CBS Radio News correspondent Steve Futterman is in Anaheim and is on the phone. So, Steve, tell us what it is that you saw.
Well, I saw much of what you've been describing. I saw actually that trash can set on fire. I saw a few rocks being thrown. This was a situation that could have gotten a lot worse. In fact, right now as we're talking, some of the police on horseback are dispersing. Most of the protesters have now left. Maybe a dozen or so, maybe 24 protesters remain on the street right now. All of this taking place, ironically, across the street from Disneyland, but this certainly wasn't the happiest place on earth today. Police were being taunted. They kept their cool for the most part. On a few occasions, they did move in. They did detain people. They did make arrests. But for the most part, this is something that could have gotten a lot worse.
Well, Steve, looking at these pictures, it seems that police were out in force. They had their riot gear. They were there on horseback, as you noted. Well prepared, it would seem, in terms of numbers for these protesters, and just in case they were required.
Absolutely. They knew what had happened last night. In fact, the police chief from Anaheim, the mayor of Anaheim, basically set out a press release earlier today saying they would not put up with what took place in Albuquerque last night. They were aware of what took place, and that, I think, really prompted maybe the larger turnout than expected of police officers. But they made their presence felt. During much of this time, you had sometimes supporters of Trump and opponents of Trump confronting each other on the street. They would yell at each other. They would push and shove at times. Police sometimes had to move in to separate the supporters and opponents of Donald Trump. But clearly there were many tense moments where the police moved in on horseback. They did, as I mentioned, detain and make arrests of a number of people. I counted around a half dozen or so. But we've seen other situations where the situation gets totally out of hand. This did not get to that level, thankfully, today.
Steve, some of the video that we're seeing right now shows some demonstrators lighting these Donald Trump hats on fire, but they've also gotten their faces obscured there. I mean, they have their scarves over their faces, presumably to try and hide their identity. Tell us about these protesters. What were they saying? What were they chanting? How would you describe that crowd?
Well, there were different types of protesters. Some of the protesters came with their families. They were, I would say, sort of the mainstream protesters. They came to protest Donald Trump, many of them from the Hispanic community, opposed to his immigration policies. They were there to make their presence felt. You did have some people, though, who seemed intent on being more confrontational, perhaps intent on having a violent confrontation. These were people who sometimes call themselves anarchists. These are people who sometimes like to wear the scarves to cover their faces. But again, it stopped short of that. There were some moments where I thought this was going to get totally out of hand, where there would be mass numbers of arrests, dozens and dozens of people, and police were prepared to do that. But it just stopped short of that. Police were able to prevent that. At times, they would separate the supporters and opponents of Donald Trump, as I mentioned, to really calm down the situation.
All right, Steve Futterman on the ground there in Anaheim, California. Steve, thanks so much.
My pleasure.